Hello, everyone, and this is NLP Radio on Stream.
Hello, everybody.
And I absolutely love being here with my guest, Alexander Gerasimov, a trainer of NLP practitioner, NLP master, a famous negotiator in Russia. Geography of seminars and trainings led by Alexander is 22 countries and 70 cities. And today the topic we are touching upon is going to be 3 perception positions in NLP. 3 positions of perception. Alexander, what is it?
Три позиции восприятия – это, по большому счету,
3 positions of perception are basically, in the usual common sense, 3 positions of view, or 3 degrees of grammatical person, where the first person refers to a stance, towards a situation, a problem, anything, whatever, through our own eyes, so-called the first position. It is expressed through to me, I, and my pronouns. This is the first viewpoint, the first position, through our own eyes. The second position refers to a stance through eyes, ears of your opponent. It is like putting yourself in other person's shoes. It is the second person in linguistics. To you, yours, and so on. The third position refers to a viewpoint of a neutral observer, a detached view, a point from which both the first and the second positions can be seen, and usually in linguistics, it's the third person, and pronouns he, she, they. It is like observing a situation without much emotional involvement.
Very clear linguistic clarification. Yeah, okay, as this is for first person, second, and third person. But what is it if we talk about perceiving the world? Is this the way we see the world? Position 1, 2, and 3?
Yes, those are positions of perception of the world. Those are habitual positions of a person, perception positions in a certain situation or context. For example, a person may be in the first position in relationships. In relationships, while at work, the second position will be the most habitual. It is not a permanent viewpoint of a person. It is rather a dynamic component when in some situation, a person may look at things from the first position, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. Or a person may look at the same situation from the second position, which also has its own pros and cons, and so on.
So this is contextual. This is contextual thing. Okay, so let's maybe start off with the position 1. You said this is I, me, and we. So there must be kind of a border, the border of my I. So how may I define it? Where the border finishes and where it begins already not me. How do I understand it?
Well, all borders are inside our mind, and we can distinguish the border, for example, between me and not me, by observing a person, or we can just ask a person a rather weird question. Where are you? Where is the border of you? And such person gradually begins to realize. By the way, Gestalt therapists have been using this practice for a long time. They like to discuss this topic. Interaction between those borders vary much. And when we control our borders, we can control our world and our perception, including our emotions. Borders of some people with regard to many things are too much stretched beyond them, too much vague. For example, they associate their car, their home with themselves. Some people, you might notice that when you come very close to such person's car, he or she feels that physically. But we are talking about the border of our perception and the border that we create by our attentiveness. We can reduce that border, remove it, or do something else. We can place someone inside that border, some kind of a border game.
A very interesting point. While you're talking, it came to my mind. I've got an acquaintance, like a colleague or a friend, who very often says in her vocabulary, it's very popular to say, like, if I have someone who does the same thing as I do and we're doing the same business together, then I feel absorbed by this person. And she says it every time. I feel absorbed. I feel like I am dripping into him. Does it mean that she has no borders? Does it mean that she has absolutely no feeling of borders if she says that all the time?
В каком-то смысле вот первая
In
позиция
some
это там, где
sense,
находится
the
я
first
человека.
position
Если
is where the
предыдущих
ego
подкастах,
of a
где мы говорили,
person
что
is.
рапорт это одно,
In
я
previous
на двоих,
podcasts,
Mhm.
we've
то можно как раз и проинтерпретировать.
in previous podcasts, when we discussed rapport, we said that rapport could be considered as a single I for two persons.
Mhm.
We can interpret. It's like if we integrate that person inside our borders. The border between us and that person disappears and we become an integrated whole. We are controlled by what we are not conscious of. And that person most likely is not conscious of what he or she is doing. So we can control such person at that moment. It is exactly a state of rapport we discussed in our previous podcasts.
Okay, so it's a positive. It's a positive sign.
Yes.
Okay, so you mentioned managing the borders. Managing. How is it possible to manage your borders?
Самый простой способ
The easiest way is managing through words. There are possessive pronouns, for example, my pen or my phone. And this phrase refers to a certain state. When you feel that it is your pen, you can make an experiment, put something in front of you, and it doesn't matter whether or not it belongs to you, and feel how your attitude toward that thing changes when you say my pen or my phone. And then let someone else touch that thing. You will feel how that person is touching your borders.
Absolutely. Pick-uppers use that all the time. When they cannot touch the lady, they touch her objects, which is the same thing.
Это как раз
Mhm.
прикосновение.
That's exactly refers to touching borders, those feelings. Or, on the contrary, you can take your thing and say, that's not my phone, it's someone else's phone. In this case, it is as if you remove the my hashtag from that thing, and it may happen that you leave your phone somewhere and forget it, and remember about it much later. This way, you can easily say farewell to some things. Some people in their intimate relationship call their partner my. A girl says, it's my boyfriend, or a guy says, it is my woman.
What's
Такое.
wrong about it?
Ну, в России крепостное право отменили.
Serfdom in Russia was abolished in 1861. This my can rather be considered as I spend more time and have more intimate relationship with that person than with other people. But a person cannot be considered as physical property, and if a person wants to sell something, to get rid of something, that person may consider that to be belonging to him or to her for a long time. For example, a person has been driving a car for a long period of time, and sometime that person gives a name to that car. The owner treats his car as, well, at least as if it were his pet. or even more, as if it were a family member. Have you ever tried to sell a family member? Well, I guess it is almost impossible. The necessary step in this situation is to remove this possessive pronoun my, to remove those borders, and then, oddly enough, ecology will be taken into account, and that car will be sold easier. It is a life hack, by the way. Some people are fond of collecting things. We can call them economic persons. You know, such people, such person begins to have more and more, things around him. If such person stays at some place for a long time, lots of unnecessary things begin to pile around him or her, so it would be reasonable to clear out that place, to declutter it, by removing the feeling of yours. For example, using words. Later, we will discuss submodalities, and we will discuss a very good technique allowing to remove the feeling of possessing something.
Right, and this is all was about position one and feeling, which is the border of me. In a very complicated way, has Alexander explained it, but okay, looks like I got into it. I think that position two is more interesting and exciting to discuss. Position two, this is kind of already interaction with another human being or another something. So I think that we will dedicate more time discussing position two, because with the first, everything is generally clear. So how to use the skill of getting into second position, and actually how to get in the second position.
The second position refers to ability to put yourself in other person's shoes, or even to become the other person. But we have a very critical specification here. We don't become an integrated whole with other person, we become the other person. When we become an integrated whole, it is some kind of a mixture of the first and the second positions, a cocktail of positions. If we are talking purely about the second position, it's about leaving your first position and transferring into the second one, to become the other person. There are various ways to do it. For example, through imitation, when we begin to mimic another person's actions, his pose, intonation, gestures, terms, words used by that person, and so on, etc. Another method is to imagine a person with his or her value system and to try this value system on. Literally, you should make yourself like what other person likes. Subject to a proper approach, it may happen that you begin to understand, feel other person with every fiber of your being. It may even happen that being in a very good second position, you can feel such person. If something happens to him or to her, sometimes you can feel it, even without having a direct contact with such person. I think everyone has such experience.
Alexander, let me ask you, is it something inborn that we are born with, or is it something that can be equally developed by anyone? Second position. Are we born with it, or do we develop it in life as a skill?
It can be trained. Surely, yes, but some people can do it easier, while it is more difficult to some other people. I suppose it depends on personal experience. For example, some people, since their childhood, when they were communicating with their parents used to ask them, what do that boy or that girl feel? What if it were you? Thus, fostering empathy in their child. What will other neighbors say? what will your classmates think about you? And such person begins to be accustomed to being in the second position, putting himself into other person's shoes, often losing himself. In another family, on the contrary, parents used to say, don't pay attention to what other people think. Be yourself. You are the most important. Everything here is for you, and a person become an egoist to a, well, certain extent.
Okay, because while you're talking, I'm trying to analyze my own self, and I certainly understand that second position is not my strongest side. It's not my strongest side. However, maybe still I'm a pedagogue, and the only context in my life where I completely get into the person, it's when I work with a student. When I'm with a student, yes, this is totally a developed skill to be in the second position with him. In all the other contexts, I believe it's not my strongest side. I'm not able to feel what someone thinks, and it seems like an extrasensoric ability to me. It really does. However, as for you, I would assume that it's your strong side, second position. I believe so.
I've been training this ability very much. Exactly the second position. Well, since my childhood, I've been rather more thinking about other people than about myself. In percentage terms, well, the second and the third positions account for about 40% each, and the first position accounts for 20. But, as you said, it depends on the context very much. In some situations, I intentionally don't take the second position because contextual requirements, system rules, but in some situations I will be in the first position in spite of everything. There are tools which cannot be bad or good. They can be appropriate or inappropriate. And every position has its own strong and weak sides, its own advantages and disadvantages.
So there is no bad position or good, as I understand. The most important thing is relevance, that it is relevant in a relevant situation. Let's try to sum up what we have already said. What are the minuses of position 1 and the obvious pluses? The minuses of position 2 and its obvious pluses, just to make it clearer.
Pros of the first position are strong made decisions. Sometimes we have to do it. It's like a child crying at a store, I wanna this toy or I wanna this sweet, until he or she gets it. Advantages are enjoying your life. In the first position, a person breathes freely and lives a full life. It immediately becomes a disadvantage. In the first position, a person suffers more. The first position often has no feedback. In some cases, it's not possible to a person being in the first position to notice other people's attitude toward him, her, or what is happening in the world because that person is too much involved. We can call it, we call it associating. A person got associated, or in other words, is in the first position. Pros of this second position are also pretty obvious. For example, during diagnostics, during any customer-centric interactions and business activities, the second position is very important. When it is very critical to understand what other person feels. No matter a doctor, a sales assistant, his level is determined by the ability to understand what other person wants, and sometimes, without knowing it himself, such person is able to find out what his customer wants.
Right. I remember you say that getting into the second position, there are lots of instruments and tools of how we may do it. And once you mentioned in one of your interviews that there is a skill, probably you have, to flow like a water into another person and start seeing and hearing and feeling everything from his body. I think this is something very powerful, a skill, of course. Then a question which goes logically and naturally from it. how not to let someone to get into your second position.
Я могу это описать субмодально, но так как мы
You
еще
know, I
субмодальности
could
не знаем,
describe it
то как бы
using
Mhm.
в
submodalities,
некоторых
but
случаях
since
все равно
we
есть
haven't
некая
discussed
первая позиция.
submodalities
Можно
yet,
сказать,
I'll
даже
describe it in other
например,
words.
скажите я
In
и
some
покажите на
situations,
себя.
some kind
Да,
of the first position
кто-то
exists
в район ушной
anyway.
клетки,
You can make an
кто-то
experiment,
покажет
say
на
I,
голову,
and point
например,
at you.
указывает.
What
Mhm.
area will you point
Кто-то
at?
покажет на
Someone
общем, например.
points to his or her
Там
chest,
находится ваша первая
someone to
позиция
his or her
субмодальная.
head,
Если вы
someone to him
Mhm.
or
делаете
herself as a
бесконечно
whole.
малый,
So your
то
first
некому
position is
некуда
there.
будет входить.
If you reduce it by means of
Либо просто опустить
submodalities and
третью
make it,
позицию полностью.
well,
То есть
infinitely
нет
small,
ни первой, ни
then the
второй,
second
только
position will be
третья, и вы ровно
unreachable. Or
Mhm.
you can totally
управляя
take the third
откуда-то.
position.
И тоже
There is neither the
входите в вторую
first
позицию
nor the
ровно.
second
Главное
position,
было
and
не
you
уйти в
are,
третью позицию
well, a
полностью.
robot
То
Okay.
есть нет никакой ни
which
первой,
is
ни второй,
controlled
только
remotely
третья,
from
и вы ровно.
somewhere. What
Mhm.
for should you take the
Управляем
second position
откуда-то.
of a
И
robot?
тоже тут. А что
Um,
входить во вторую позицию кроме
there is
себя?
nothing
Ничего
there,
нет.
generally speaking.
Mhm. Yeah, but I believe it needs lots of training to be able to do so. Maybe years of training.
Первые лет 7
It's
трудно,
hard for the
потом
first 7
привыкаешь.
years, but then you'll get accustomed.
This is real professionalism of NLP to be able to do these things. Okay, so maybe let's move on to the third position. Position 3 we haven't touched upon yet.
Это позиция наблюдателя.
This
Взгляд
is
со стороны,
position of an
безэмоциональный.
observer,
Там тоже есть свои
a
плюсы и минусы.
detached
Плюсом
view
это как
without
раз вот
much
эта
emotional
отмороженность,
involvement.
если
It
сказать.
also has
То
its
есть
own
Mhm.
pros and
человек не
cons.
чувствует
For
ничего,
example,
ощущает,
recklessness, let us
как
use a slang
видеокамерный
expression,
наблюдатель. То есть
is
просто
an
фиксирует
advantage.
Есть
A
определенные
person feels
правила,
nothing
есть
and
определенные
turns into
задачи,
a
которые стоят.
CCTV
И
camera
обычно
and
в
just
этой позиции
observes what is
находятся
happening.
хладнокровные достаточно люди,
There are certain
которые могут
rules,
в
there are certain
экстремальных ситуациях
tasks to
поступать
be implemented.
по,
The
например,
third
там,
position is usually taken by
ну, вот в
rather
этой ситуации
cool-headed
правила.
persons
Mhm.
По
who,
технике
even in extreme
безопасности,
situations, can behave
инструкции
in
какой-либо.
compliance with rules
Это
adopted
плюс
for
в
such
некоторых
situations,
случаях. Но в
following
этих же случаях
safety
это может быть и
procedures or
минус.
guidelines.
Когда ты общаешься
It
со
is an
своим
advantage
человеком,
in some
ты
cases,
чувствуешь
but it may be
душевного
a
тепла, и хотят с
disadvantage
тобой
in the same
робот.
situation.
Даже
When
проводили
you are
такие эксперименты.
communicating with
В
such
Японии
a person, you
решили
don't
убрать
feel emotional
продавцов и
warmth
поставили роботов.
as
Mhm.
if it is
Рядом
a
были
robot
роботы, можно
next
было
to
у них
you.
обслужиться
Relative
на кассе.
experiments were
И
made
были
in
живые
Japan.
люди тоже.
They decided to
И люди все равно
replace
предпочитали
checkout
человека,
clerks with robots.
а не робота. Сейчас
There
даже
were
вот
cash
в некоторых
registers
супермаркетах,
served by
если
humans
стоят
and by robots,
перекрестки, точно это такая
and
сеть.
customers
Mhm.
preferred to be served
Компания.
by humans,
Там
not by
кто-то может
robots.
подойти к
I
человеку в
know
кассе,
in many
кто-то к роботу.
supermarkets, for example
И
in
иногда
Перекресток
к роботам
retail
вообще
chain,
нет очередей при
there are
присутствии
both manned
компании.
and automatic
Там
cash registers,
кто-то может
and
подойти к
sometimes
человеку в
there
кассе,
are
а
no
кто-то к роботу.
queues before
И
robotic cash
иногда к
registers.
роботам вообще.
Of course, because there is no energy. A human being gives energy and the robot doesn't. So surely it's explainable.
А
Mhm.
есть люди,
There are
которых это
people
полностью устраивает.
absolutely
Mhm.
satisfied with
Например,
that.
как сказал
For
кто-то
example,
известный,
a famous
чем больше
person
я
is
знаю
quoted
людей,
as
тем больше я
saying,
люблю собак.
"The more I know
Можно его
people, the more I
перефразировать,
like
the more я
dogs."
люблю компьютеры. Может,
It
чем больше
could
я
be
людей, тем больше я
reformulated.
люблю
The
собак.
more I like
Можно
computers.
его
You
перефразировать,
know,
чем больше я
it
люблю
is true for
компьютеры.
a large amount
Большое
of
количество
people.
людей. Это и
It is
плюс, и минус сразу же.
simultaneously both
И, наверное,
advantage
основной
and disadvantage.
минус
The main
это как раз
disadvantage
вот эта
is that
безэмоциональность, как будто не живой
emotionlessness,
человек.
as if it
Mhm.
is not
И
an
мы это
alive human
состояние,
being.
мы НЛперы
We,
называем
NLPers,
диссоциация,
call this state
где первая это
dissociation.
ассоциация,
The
где
first
третья позиция
position
это
is association.
диссоциация, то
The
есть
third
полная
position is
безэмоциональность.
dissociation, an absolute emotionlessness.
I believe people with a very well developed third position are people with the best nervous system ever, aren't they?
Это
It is a very
очень мощный
strong
плюс,
advantage
Mhm.
and
абсолютно
absolutely good
здоровый.
mental health.
Что бы ни
Whatever
происходило
happens
вокруг,
around,
этот
this
человек
person
робот,
is
это
a
происходит лучше.
robot. this ability can be trained. Sometimes it can be caused by a physiological trauma, when a person considers himself to be forbidden to feel emotions. Well, after a traumatic event, we cannot call it a good or bad or healthy position. No. We are talking about a tool. Sometimes we have to be emotionless in a stressful situation, but when we go to a cinema to watch an interesting movie, we may be emotional.
Sure. I believe that, once again, I will repeat, there is no bad or no good in any of them. And maybe the most useful skill, ability, is not to fall down into any of them. So I'm sure there should be exercises, some kind of practice how to do so. And since I am mostly interested in position 3, when I have stress at my work, when I have stress with my bosses, what is the way to practice position 3 that I can suddenly get it?
Number one is a weird skill of talking about yourself in the third person. When something happens, you can talk about yourself as about him or her. This is the first way. The second one is to look in the mirror. It is also dissociating, a detached view of yourself. When you see yourself with uncombed hair, with a red face, it disillusions. In some situations, if you have such an opportunity, well, you can take.
Cold shower?
If you have an opportunity to take a cold shower or just to wash your face, or if you have such an opportunity to go to a window and to stare off into the distance, if you're sitting while feeling a lot of emotions, you can stand up. Or, for example, step aside from that place if you're standing. And if you have such an opportunity, you can move away, step aside from a situation.
Because there is an anchor on this location. Negative anchor?
Well, you can say it this way. Speaking another description language, it is dissociation, a detached view. You can, for example, it is also a very good method. Describe a situation to start talking about what is happening, but you should not use names. Your name or someone else's name. You have to say that person, he came, he said, and you should avoid using emotional expressions. For example, you should avoid saying he is upset. You'd better say he began to breathe slower. His shoulders moved down. He sat and lowered his head. It will be another sort of description, an emotionless description, because as soon as we begin to name emotions, we immediately start getting immersed into them. In order to prevent falling into this first position, all these tools can be used.
Well, this was excellent, really. Just immaculate what you just said. I will definitely re-listen to this episode and will practice it. Right, since we have mentioned the 3 positions and each of them in detail, then I would like to get maybe to the last question of this podcast today. Is interposition moving, the moving between the positions? What would you say about that?
If you get the feel of the first position, the third position, the second position very well, they are different. Even within the same specific situation, in order to feel a position absolutely pure in comparison to other positions, it is recommended that you should follow a very simple rule: to switch between the first and the second positions only through the position number 3 and backward. Let it be a shower as a metaphor. A person gets back home from his work and takes a shower or changes clothes, puts on homewear before starting doing his household chores. This skill should be reversible. When a person goes to work, he or she puts on a suit or work clothes. On the one hand, it is an anchor, and on the other hand, it is some sort of clearing. So the main rule is that you should, necessarily switch between the first and the second positions through the third position.
So we can manage it ourselves. For instance, sitting at a meeting, we can change those positions ourselves, right? Managing this process. Okay. Thank you very much, Alexander. That was extremely useful, extremely exactly to the point for today and for now. Okay, I would like to say that no matter how many books you read and no matter how many radio podcasts you will listen to, the only way to really acquire NLP skills is your experience. So please write down below in the commentaries whatever you would like to comment on what Alexander has told us.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.